Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for an evening that is dedicated to shorelines and what we can do to protect them. We know that island shorelines are valuable for both ecological, cultural, and recreational reasons. And from clam gardens to fish weirs to middens, the shorelines of the Islands Trust area have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. Much of the Salish Sea's marine life, including salmon, whales, and birds, relies on nearshore habitat for spawning, for early life, and for food. And this is why preserving and protecting shorelines is so critical. So I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us this evening to be with us for this third webinar in the Islands Trust Stewardship Education Program for 2026, or 2025, 2026, I should say. My name's Chloe Straw, and I'm the program coordinator with the Islands Trust. And we're so privileged to have a panel of passionate people with us this evening to share the work that they're doing to promote shoreline health in the Islands Trust region. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to just quickly share with you some housekeeping items. You may notice that only our presenters are visible on screen tonight. That's just so that we can keep control of any background noise and make sure that we have all a really clear view of their presentations. Um, and only the panelists and presenters will be able to speak. By all means, we very much want to hear from you. So please go ahead and use the Q&A or chat function to enter in any questions that you have, and we will make sure to take those up when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening. I also want to thank staff who are supporting us behind the scenes this evening. Thank you to my colleague Morgana Van Niekerk, our communication specialist, to Director of Trust Area Services, Claire Frater, behind the scenes, and to our Director of Planning Services, Stefan Cermak, who is also here to support the event. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our wonderful panel of presenters tonight. We have Kyla Sheehan, who is a biologist with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, where she manages the Resilient Coasts for Salmon project. Kyla holds a Master of Science in Ecological Restoration from Simon Fraser University and the British Columbia Institute of Technology. With a deep appreciation for wetland and coastal habitats, Kyla is passionate about actively planning for sea level rise to keep communities safe while building or conserving habitat for coastal species like the Pacific salmon. Kelly Locke is a registered professional forester with a Master's of Science in Forest Science from the University of Alberta. She's the project manager of Green Shores, as well as a member of the Resilient Coasts for Salmon project team, a 5-year collaborative project between the Stewardship Centre for BC and the Pacific Salmon Foundation. The project includes community outreach and engagement, Green Shores training, which we'll learn more about tonight, establishing demonstration sites, and shoreline mapping to build public awareness and community capacity to adopt nature-based solutions. Also with us this evening is Megan Tomlin, who works for Lands and Environment at Malahat Nation, where her current focus is marine stewardship initiatives and restoration projects. Megan supports community-led efforts to revitalize clam gardens, utilizing Indigenous knowledge and Western science practices to care for the coast and strengthen connections to the land and the sea. And Stephen Henry is also with us this evening. Stephen Henry Jr., pardon me, is a guardian with the Malahat Nation who's passionate about learning and carrying forward cultural harvesting and stewardship practices. Through his work, he's committed to protecting the marine environment and ensuring that Malahat's waters and lands are sustained for generations to come. So thank you so much again for joining us this evening. And without further ado, I will pass it over to our first presenter, Kyla.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being here this evening. As Chloe said, I'm a biologist with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and I run a program called the Resilient Coast for Salmon Project. I am going to share my screen here. Alrighty, could I get a thumbs up that everyone's seeing the slides okay?
Looks great.
Thanks, Chloe. All right. Yeah, thank you all for joining this evening. I'm calling in this evening from my home in Sydney on the traditional territories of the Kwasanich peoples, and I raise my hands in gratitude to the Kwasanich peoples for their ongoing stewardship of the land and waters here. So this evening, I'll be sharing a little bit about the Resilient Coast for Salmon project, as well as the impacts of shoreline hardening and what we can all do to improve coastal habitats and protect these vital ecosystems. And then I'm going to finish up with just a quick look at the coastal marine strategy. So to start, I am from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, as I said. The acronym is PSF. If you haven't heard of PSF, we are an environmental nonprofit that was founded in 1987 with the main goal of providing thoughtful leadership on the conservation, restoration, and enhancement of Pacific salmon and their habitats. And we work with all members of the salmon community to do so. The Resilient Coast for Salmon project is a 5-year, really collaborative partnership led by PSF with partners like the Stewardship Center for BC, Peninsula Streams and Shorelines, and many others. And we're funded through an Environment and Climate Change Canada grant. And through that funding, we aim to raise awareness on the coastal impacts of climate change and really encourage moving away from hard armoring structures like seawalls and more towards nature-based approaches to shoreline adaptation when possible. We've done a ton with this project over the last 5 years, but in the interest of time, this evening I'm just going to be talking about one component, which is our shoreline mapping initiative. So I'll direct you to our website to learn more about our educational outreach, our Green Shores training, and 3 restoration sites on Vancouver Island. And I believe you'll hear from Kelly a little bit about those restoration sites as well. So here's a look at our geographic scope of the project. We're focused on the east coast of Vancouver Island from Victoria to Port McNeill. And as you can see, we're in the final year of our project, which ends in March of 2026. So as part of this project, we have mapped the entire east coast of Vancouver Island. To build our data set, we conducted boat-based mapping, collecting both high-resolution and 360-degree imagery from our vessel, Wilbur, and he's shown on the right hand of the screen there. And then from that imagery, we created map data of where we found these 3 feature types. The first is coastal modification, like seawalls. The second is log accumulation on beaches. And the third are overwater structures, like personal docks and marinas. And since the extent of coastal hard armoring is currently a knowledge gap for a ton of communities, we hope that this will be a valuable data set for local planners, for researchers and decision makers, as a step towards encouraging policy change for shoreline development and also protecting valuable habitat. And of course, all 3 of these feature types will have impacts on Pacific salmon and their habitats, as well as many other creatures of the coastal food web, which I'll get into in the next few slides here. But to get us started, let's think about why we care so much about what is happening on the shoreline. In her presentation, Kelly's going to get into this in a lot more detail about what happens at the shoreline juncture. So I'm going to keep it really high level. And as many of you may already be familiar with, the coastal environment is this really critical transition zone where the terrestrial environment or the land meets the marine environment or the water. And this transition zone offers a ton of unique habitats. And actually, 80% of BC wildlife species use the shoreline at some stage in their life. So these areas also provide space for gradual change. You can see that nice sloping shoreline in the illustration there. And this provides a space for things like salinity levels in the soil to change gradually. And as you can see, this unaltered shoreline provides a ton of habitats on that sloped seafloor, as well as it provides the space for incoming waves to slow down. And having healthy shorelines supports not just salmon habitat, but our entire way of life on the coast. So healthy habitats are foundational to the health of the coastal food web. For example, starting with something like riparian habitat of trees and shrubs that overhang the shoreline, this provides shade on the beaches where forage fish like Pacific sandlance and surf smelt spawn. And in turn, forage fish are an important prey for Pacific salmon. And then salmon are also receiving food from riparian insects that fall off of those overhanging branches. And we know that salmon are important prey for resident killer whales. And those same forage fish are important prey for migratory humpback whales. So in that example, you can see all of these components of the coastal ecosystem are interconnected and are foundational for providing access to food, food security, and cultural and spiritual significance. And we are a part of this ecosystem as well in a reciprocal relationship. So if we care for the shoreline ecosystem, we can make them more resilient to climate change, which benefits the natural world as well as coastal communities. And here are just some of the coastal critters that we have encountered in our mapping project. So you can see some sea otters, bald eagles, blue heron, black-tailed deer, and tons of jumping fish. And of course, all of these animals depend on healthy shoreline habitats. And as I said, humans are a huge part of this coastal food web. And unfortunately, that means that there are a lot of human-associated factors that impact salmon and the coastal ecosystem. Kelly's going to get into a bit more about how humans have modified the shorelines, but I'll just stick to the three main feature types that we mapped in our mapping project and talk about how they specifically impact the habitat. So let's take a closer look at coastal modification structures or hard armoring. So these can be features like seawalls, homes, sheds, riprap, any real structure that's built below the natural boundary. So when shorelines are hard armored, like we see on the left side of this illustration, that complexity at the transition zone of the shoreline is cut off. So seawalls prevent habitat from adapting to changing conditions, where they're no longer able to naturally migrate landward with sea level rise. And this contributes to something called coastal squeeze. And then we also have scour that happens at the base of a wall. So when waves crash into them, they can disrupt the sediment and morphology of the shoreline. And this can reduce habitat for many species and in turn reduces opportunities for food harvesting. And armored shorelines can also impact the diets of Pacific salmon. So shoreline armoring has been shown to have fewer and less diverse epibenthic invertebrates, which are a really important food source to salmon. Whereas on a natural shoreline, terrestrial insects are available as food from the riparian vegetation and from the detritus on the beach. So as a result, when young salmon are next to a seawall or another artificial structure, they end up feeding on alternative types of prey that might be harder to catch and are less nutritious. And then we have overwater structures. So these can be things like residential docks, ferry terminals, marinas, and industrial structures that shade the nearshore. So this can influence salmon behavior and actually put them at more risk of predation. So the lack of light underneath these structures seems to make salmon nervous. They're visual predators, and so they can't see their prey. They also can't see what may be chasing them, and they can't school together very easily. The lack of light underneath them, underneath the structures, also alters the food availability as it changes the types of plankton and marine plants that grow there. So again, salmon are avoiding these areas. They're swimming into deeper water, which expends more energy and possibly exposes them to more predators. And then we have log accumulation. I'm just going to see if this video will go. So this was taken at a beach in Victoria where a ton of escaped processed logs were being moved around during a storm. So when they're moved by waves and storms, logs can scour the beaches, which changes the sediment composition. They can also accumulate on beaches in unnatural densities, where they can smother forage fish habitats in the sand, as well as maybe vegetation that is trying to grow. Logs also have detrimental impacts on rocky shorelines. So it's not just sandy shorelines that are at risk here. A recent study showed that populations of key foundational intertidal species, such as the thatched barnacle, it was found to be 20 to 80% lower on rocky intertidal areas where there was abrasion from logs compared to adjacent areas that were protected from the abrasion. coming back to our shoreline mapping project, the data set, including the shoreline imagery and the 3 digitized layers of coastal modification over water structures and log accumulation, will be available in March 2026. This will be housed within PSF's Marine Data Center on a page called the Resilient Coast for Salmon Atlas. And the Atlas will be this central hub where you can access all of our community reports, data collection protocols. You can also download the data, and you'll be able to visualize the data on an interactive map. And here is a short video that's walking you through our draft map. So this map will allow researchers, planners, and community members to explore and better understand the coastal modifications in their community. So this map includes the 3 resilient coast for salmon layers. You can see there the overwater structures, shoreline modification, and log accumulation. But users can also overlay additional data sets from external resources to view the data in a broader ecological context. So by overlaying our data with other important data like shoreline sensitivity to sea level rise, wave exposure, and forage fish habitat, excuse me, we can identify areas of concern and prioritize them for restoration. And we plan to speak to local Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments about our findings and what can be done with these data. Our goal is for this to be carried on, for this to result in some actions and protections at the local level. So now I'd like to turn to some actions that we can all take to improve the coastal environment. In Kelly's presentation, she's going to dive a little deeper into the Green Shores recommendations for naturalizing shorelines away from seawalls. So I wanted to showcase a few other actions that we can take. So whether you live directly on the shoreline or not, managing runoff is one way to help protect salmon and all creatures living in the nearshore, since it helps prevent contaminants from entering our waterways. To help manage water on our properties, we can reduce the amount of impervious surfaces, and these are things like paved driveways or patios. These areas don't allow rainwater to soak into the land, so contaminants can be picked up and they flow directly overland into storm drains and ultimately into waterways. So if we replaced paved driveways with pervious pavers that have spaces in between the paving stones, and if we plant more native vegetation in the upland, we can reduce potentially harmful runoff. And other ways to help reduce runoff are by installing rain gardens to hold, collect, and filter runoff, as well as we can collect water for reuse in catchment basins. And a garden filled with native plants will require fewer inputs like irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticide sprays, since they are more suited to local conditions. So if we choose drought-tolerant native species, you can also reduce your water usage in the summer months, which helps keeps water in the streams for salmon. And thinking about runoff in our last slide, you can opt for compost to nourish your garden over chemical fertilizers to help prevent those excess nutrients from ending up in waterways. And as I mentioned, overwater structures like piers and docks can be really scary for young salmon. So if you are considering creating a dock or upgrading your dock, you might want to explore possibly sharing with a neighbor. Or you could build one that has features to let light through, which is really helpful for salmon and also the eelgrass habitats that might be growing underneath them. And another option is to install a floating dock that does not require any pilings on the seafloor. So these types of docks can be removed from the water in the wintertime, which helps free up that habitat when the dock is not being used. And finally, we recommend avoiding materials like wood treated with creosote, because this can be really detrimental to the success of herring spawn events. And finally, for shoreline property owners, you can provide major benefits by naturalizing your shoreline. And as I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, the shoreline is this transition zone. So notice in this illustration, we have an extended buffer zone between the aquatic environment and the terrestrial environment. So it's really important that we do not restrict the space, but when we impose hard structures like seawalls, we are forcing that transition from terrestrial to aquatic to be really abrupt. So in her presentation, Kelly's going to give us a great overview of the importance of this zone and ways that you can maintain or create a buffer zone on your property. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And if you'd like to learn more about nature-based solutions and the coastal impacts of climate change, you can check out our website for a ton of helpful resources, including educational articles and videos. So that's resilientcoast.ca. And I just want to finish by touching on the BC Coastal Marine Strategy. So if you haven't heard of this, it was co-developed between the BC government and BC Coastal First Nations between 2020 and 2024. And this strategy was meant to outline the priorities for BC to help manage and protect the coast. The Coastal Marine Strategy is not legislative, but instead it's meant as the baseline knowledge of what matters most on the coast. And from there, we can build actionable management plans and legislation and protected areas. And some of the core priorities that were outlined in the Coastal Marine Strategy include ensuring abundant populations of wild Pacific salmon, clean waters and coasts, diverse marine life, vibrant coastal communities, and trusting and respectful relationships. And one major way we can support this work is to advocate for what you believe in. So you can take action by writing to the Premier of BC or your local MPs to push for legislative action to do with the Coastal Marine Strategy. And just back in October, the Clean Coast Act was passed, and this will help to enforce cleanup of wrecked and abandoned vessels, as well as debris from marine infrastructure like styrofoam from marinas. So your voice does matter to back up the advocacy that has been done to date. And there are some amazing groups that I will link in the chat that you can follow along for more news about the Coastal Marine Strategy. And I'll just wrap up with just a thought about how we can be a part of living the priorities of the Coastal Marine Strategy by being stewards of our coastal communities. So we can use the nature-based actions that I outlined and what you'll hear from Kelly next up. And you can also get involved with a local stewardship group to give back. And one of the core intentions of the Coastal Marine Strategy is to build trusting and respectful relationships. So you can be a part of this by learning about the traditional territories on which you live. And if invited, you can help out with habitat restoration on those territories. So I encourage you to look up how you can get involved where you live. And I'll leave it there. Hi, Zepka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyla, for that very informative presentation and some really clear tips on what landowners and citizens can do, as well as that very clear call to action on the coastal marine strategy. We need to make sure that that gets ratified into legislation. So thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to start us off and to lead into Kelly, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Green Shores program.
Thank you so much, Chloe and Kyla, colleague and friend. I'm Kelly Locke. I'm with the Green Shores Projects Manager with SEBC and a very happy partner of the Resilient Coast for Salmon project. I'm coming to you from Cobble Hill on the traditional territories of the Cowichan peoples. And are you seeing the right mode? Maybe not. There we go.
Looks good.
So the
Thanks, Kelly.
Stewardship Center, yeah, was that good and audio is good? Awesome. The Stewardship Center for BC, for those of you that maybe aren't aware, has a fundamental mandate to help people connect to their environments and help them to understand, and then they can act in best way in using best practices. And I think that's probably a common theme from everyone on this call today. But I just want to mention that that's the mandate. And some of the outcomes I'm hoping for my presentation tonight are to talk a little bit more about values of our shoreline ecosystems and what a healthy shoreline does look like. And Kyla definitely touched on a lot of that, which is really, really helpful. Talk more about impacts and threats of shorelines, because that's where we can make a difference. Talk about shoreline improvements and how nature-based solutions can be a better approach. And then talk about those Green Shores demonstration sites that have been part of the Resilient Coast for Salmon project. So what is Green Shores? It's a framework for designing and applying nature-based approaches to shoreline management. So, the sense is that we're going to have development on our shorelines. It's inevitable in some locations for sure, but we can do it in a way that's thoughtful and balances values of both people. So that's the socioeconomic part of it, as well as the ecological or environmental. And it can help green shores. Green shores can also help communities to adapt to climate change. There are 4 key guiding principles, which we always kind of refer to and say, is this a Green Shores project or not? And firstly, we're trying to preserve or restore physical processes, and sediment and water do need to move along shorelines to maintain that health. We try to maintain or even enhance habitat function and diversity. So that's the biodiversity piece. We want to prevent or reduce pollutants from entering the aquatic environment. So we as homeowners can make a difference by what we do, for example, in our land and our landscaping on the upland. And then we want to avoid or reduce cumulative impacts. And Kyla had a really great salmon photo there of showing just how many ways humans can impact the landscape. So Green Shores is based on 2 credit rating systems, Green Shores for homes and Green Shores for shoreline development. The one for homes, as it sounds, is for residential, and Green Shores for shoreline development, or GSSD as we call it, is for larger scale projects, multi-unit, strata, and also for dike realignment, which is kind of more common on the East Coast, but basically that's creating more salt marsh or estuary. And these are intended to be guides. They're not cookbooks, but they're intended to provide a lot of resources and guidance around how to develop shorelines in a shore-friendly way. We do offer Green Shores training, as Chloe was mentioning. There's 3 levels to that, and maybe some of you have had a chance to attend. I would love to see you. Level 1 is a 1-day introduction to Green Shores. Level 2 is an application of the Green Shores credit rating system, so kind of diving into those credit rating systems a little more. And then level 3 is proficiency in Green Shores, and it's called Green Shores Approved Professional. And we're hoping to kind of marry people's varied professions, whether it's landscape architecture, coastal engineering, biology, whatever, with proficiency on applying the Green Shores frameworks. So why do we care about our shorelines? I think we're getting a common theme here that we all love our shorelines. They're super important. Many of our world's largest cities have been established on or near the shoreline. And so we need to always keep that in mind, that humans do love them and hopefully want to protect them. The riparian zone, again, is just such a vital zone that we can make a difference as homeowners and just people interacting with their environment. So we tend to put our infrastructure in that upland or terrestrial zone, and then the buffer in between the riparian zone buffer provides soil stability. If we keep our riparian vegetation in place, it filters water, so it takes out those contaminants that can potentially run downhill. It provides microclimate for small organisms, and in general provides wildlife habitat. So there's just so many important features about the riparian zone. And again, with Green Shores projects, I always think that if we can build up our riparian zone, make it more robust, and help people to understand the importance of it, we've done a really important thing. And as Kyla mentioned, our little juvenile salmon depend on terrestrial sources of food as well. And one study actually showed that more than 50% of stomach contents of juvenile salmon was coming from terrestrial, which is quite interesting given that they're always swimming around in the water. But these are the spugs and the leaf litter and things that come off the trees. And so as a forester, I'm always helping people to understand the importance of keeping their trees on their shorelines, perhaps going for a frame view instead of a clear-cut view, and just recognizing the importance of native vegetation, including shrubs and trees and so on. So forage fish is another really key component to our shorelines, and maybe some of you know about surf smelt or sand lance. I feel like I'm still learning about them, but they're such an important part of the aquatic food web. And then we've also got herring spawning offshore on some of the aquatic vegetation. And then, as I think, again, as Kyla mentioned, fish use the shoreline at different times in different ways in their life cycle. And so what we do on the shoreline one time of the year, even just our behaviors, can make a difference for how fish can interact with that same shoreline in a different part of the year. And that food web, wow, it goes right back to the rack line. So that little zone along shorelines where you've got the, little bits of leaf and detritus and bugs and bits of driftwood and things like that. Sometimes people want to take that home and put it in their gardens because it is nice fertilizer, but it's actually nicer to keep it on the shoreline because it's so important as a nutrient source and as a habitat location. So, and it's really kind of one of those starting points of this aquatic food web that links through to those surf, smelt, and forage fish to salmon through to iconic species like orca and grizzly bears for that matter. So this is just a graphic showing how we need to think large scale. When I mentioned sediment and water moving along shorelines, it's coming from somewhere, potentially up watershed, upper watershed. It could be trapped if there's a dam, hopefully not. Maybe it comes down, it meets the shoreline. And in being sourced from somewhere, that's what we call the sediment source. And it also moves along and then becomes, when it slows down in velocity, for example, or is moved along a shoreline to a place that becomes a sink. So there's sediment sources and sinks, and these can be really large scale. And we need to think of that when we consider what we do on our little lot line, that it's all connected, and we can make a difference on the function of the overall shoreline by what we do in our segment of it. We need to think about our shore types as well. And wow, in BC, it's so amazing how many different types of shorelines we have. We have our really valuable high biodiversity estuaries. We have rocky shores, for example, Bowen Island. If anyone's been over there, there's a lot of rocky shorelines. We have sediment shores, which can be the finer sands and small gravels. And then a little bit bigger than that, the boulders and cobbles. That could be like Gabriola, where you have that nice sandstone, Gabriola sandstones intermixed with some boulders and things like that. And it's important to consider this because it affects kind of what we can do and how resilient the shoreline is, even before we consider doing anything or even being there. And so I wanted to give a shout out to some really great mapping that Islands Trust has actually done for a lot of the Gulf Islands. And this shows us the types of shorelines that are on different parts of the island, where the winds, the prevailing winds and storms are coming from, what type of exposure they have, because this all links to what type of strategy we might use when we're developing or designing protection for the shoreline. So I just really wanted to give a shout out for this because it's important to get a really solid baseline information and work with a solid project team when you're doing designs on your shoreline as well. So this is just some examples of human threats and human impacts, definitely not an exhaustive list. We have filled in areas such as wetlands to create more upland, get a little bit closer to the water. We've added contaminants that can be from air, land, and water, as well as invasive species. And we have supposedly protected the shoreline, or attempted to protect the shoreline, I would say, by having seawalls, riprap, you can see that in the bottom photo, and other structures that interrupt that sediment and water moving along a shoreline. These are some other examples. Sometimes we put our infrastructure in houses a little bit too close to, for example, an eroding bluff. If anyone's been to Savory Island, there's a lot of bluff action there, and it's just so important to be thinking about that from the get-go. Where are you going to put your new home? And then sometimes, as I mentioned, we take out that riparian vegetation because we don't want a more open view, for example. And that can cause erosion and basically overall degradation of the shoreline because you've lost those sources of food falling into the water, for example, and you get a potential for erosion, which can lead to the bottom photo, which is, oh my goodness, I have erosion. I need to put in some shoreline or hardening. So we're trying to, I think with Green Shores and probably with a lot of our work in Resilient Coast for Salmon, just really raise awareness that there are alternatives and to be proactive earlier on in this cycle. So these are other examples. We encroach upon the shoreline, we harden it, that's very concrete seawall there, and then we remove and infill along the riparian zone. And I would say there's a real lack of biodiversity with a lot of lawn there. And interestingly, when people supposedly protect their shorelines with hard armor, the physics are such that you're actually increasing the wave energy about 5 to 10 times potentially. So the wave comes in, it can't break naturally as it would along that naturalized shoreline that Kyla was mentioning. It actually hits the seawall, increases in wave energy, overtops and causes issues with that, and then falls back down and causes that erosion at the base of the seawall. And there is a seawall that actually had what we call a catastrophic failure. So the whole seawall kind of cantilevered over in Qualicum Beach, if you ever want to take a look. That happened during, I think it was the atmospheric river of November 2021. So over time, even a seawall is compromised by this process. We need to be thinking about sea level rise, and this really varies. It depends where you are along which coastline. I was just in Halifax, and the East Coast is actually having I would say a more serious situation. Got a lot of subsidence along their coastline, so they're aiming for about a 1.5 meter sea level rise by 2021. Generally on the West Coast, we go with about a 1 meter, but it's really variable. And I would say that just consider it, be aware of it, and build it into the design, because it's going to depend on which greenhouse gas emission curve is used and a number of other variables. So just in summary, these are some of the threats and challenges for shorelines. Development in general, if not done thoughtfully, are invasives, plants, animals, and so on. Climate change and SLR overall. Disruptions to coastal sediment process. So sometimes a groin is put in or a dock is put in a way that is not using best practices. We tend to lose habitat sometimes, and even threats to cultural heritage, which I believe our speakers after this might be able to speak a little bit more to that as well. So we're trying to help homeowners go from something like this, where you've got your riprap or your hardened shorelines, to something like this, a more naturalized shoreline where you've got your native vegetation, you've got a more gradual profile, you don't have overwater structures, and in general, these shorelines are more resilient to climate change, and that's both sea level rise and lake level rise, because with more intense storms, we're expecting lakes to be more flashy as well. And I would argue that aesthetics might be better in these scenarios, as well as access. There's no big wall to try to get down to the shoreline from. And with Green Shores, we're always trying to promote kind of a range of options. And I think that's exciting, because different sites have different amounts of energy from wind and waves and prevailing storms and so on. So anything from that hybrid where you're blending hard and soft elements through to a soft scenario where you might be adding what we call beach nourishment or sands and gravels, to a soft, sort of naturalized, I'm not sure if you've seen that or not, a naturalized or no human disturbance. So this might be a location where less is more, and it might be just something as simple as increasing the riparian buffer, as I mentioned, taking out any infrastructure in the riparian buffer if it's there, and or setback of your structures if there's new builds. So these are some projects just to give you some examples. This is Agate Lane in Victoria, nicely naturalized shoreline. And if I could show you the whole shoreline where there's a lot of concrete, this is really quite refreshing and more, I would argue, more resilient for the homeowners and robust to changes over time. This is Prospect Lake in Victoria as well. And this was kind of a case of less is more, in that the homeowners kind of stopped mowing their lawn, part of it, closer to the riparian zone, and they increased the width of the riparian zone, and that brought about more resilience to the shoreline. They also kept their overhanging trees. You can see a lot of vegetation in this photo, and they've got little snakes that hang out on their shoreline path, which is just a few rocks. So again, design for access is another key feature about protecting the shoreline. I'd like to talk a little bit about our Green Shores demonstration sites, which have been part of the Resilient Coast for Salmon project. I think for a lot of people, seeing is believing, knowing what kind of options exist out there for nature-based approaches. These are the 3 projects. I think they're pretty exciting. They've been going over a number of years. Esquimalt Gorge and Songies are complete. Esquimalt Gorge is recently completed, and Dyke Road Park will be completing in the spring of 2026. Esquimalt Gorge Park, as it sounds, is in Esquimalt. Songies is in the city of Victoria, and Dyke Road Park is in Comox. So just to show you a little bit about these 3 demo sites, Esquimalt Gorge Park had quite a sharp escarpment from anthropogenic materials that had been put in. So that was causing an abrupt shift to the shoreline, which is not particularly resilient to sea level rise. So that was reprofiled. Different sediments were added with the hopes that forage fish will return. This split rail fence was put in because a very extensive riparian zone was planted with native plants, and we had a number of planting parties. So as Kyla mentioned, if you get a chance to get out and work in your communities on these types of projects, it's pretty exciting. And signage. So there's always chances for education. And we've got an ecology of the gorge and a Green Shores sign at the sites. And we've had a number of training groups out to these sites and meetings and such. So it's always a good chance to share what's been done. The Songies Walkway Pocket Beach is located right next to the Victoria International Marina. You can see it in the right-hand photo there. The little pocket beach had a lot of rebar and concrete and asphalt and basically a lot of garbage. And so it was restored with the sediments that probably would have been there prior to development. So you can see that on the right side. And what's really neat about this project is it's just a really well-loved beach now. People hang out there all the time. I saw a winter swimmer the other day when I popped by. And then they did have surf smelt spawning within 2 weeks, I think it was, of the project restoration. So that's really exciting as well. And then the riparian zone was really buffered with a number of native plants that actually now are a great home and forage for pollinators and birds that apparently nest, apparently some swallows are nesting underneath the marina. And then we've got Dyke Road Park in Comox with a whole new kind of salt marsh area and zone built up to it. And then this is showing at high tide. So the intent here in this very important estuary, the Comox estuary, if anyone's been there, it's considered a class 1 estuary, home to at least 5 different species of salmon. It's considered an important birding area. So a number of birds use the area for migrating and living. And that channel was created. It wasn't in place before. So that whole plan of allowing movement of water and sediment to restore the shoreline is now in place. And the little gray pathway is actually an elevated boardwalk, which is also really unique. We don't have this at any other Green Shores projects. And it's excellent in that it allows people to be immersed in their riparian and salt marsh experience without damaging. And that when I mentioned access before, we always want people to be able to access shorelines, but do it in a way that's thoughtful and doesn't cause further degradation to the shoreline. Another issue I would say, at Dyke Road Park and other project sites is geese herbivory. So Canada geese, one of 7 varieties, love to munch on the salt marsh, and because they do it so effectively, they can really kill off salt marshes. So we've been working with the Comox First Nation right from the start of the Dyke Road Park project, and they've been excellent project partners in that they've right from the design workshop onward, and then they've developed specifically and installed these cultural fences composed of willow and alder that are intended to reduce the flight path of the geese so that they can't land in the salt marsh and devour it. So just in summary, we can expect that infrastructure and development on shorelines is at least likely, so we can try to do it in a way that protects those values of humans and the environment. We do need to think about site-specific conditions. I was mentioning that islands trust mapping, different kind of shorelines, thinking about what different approaches will be most effective. That's where your project team is important. And then the key objectives, I always think, should come back to those 4 key principles around natural processes, habitat, reducing pollutants, and reducing cumulative impacts as well. And wherever we can, it's nice if we can emulate nature, because nature-based solutions really are effective in a lot of settings, not in all, but in many. And always, as Kyla mentioned, it's all about collaboration and partnership. And I just want to give a big shout out to many groups that have been involved in the demonstration sites and in Green Shores projects and in training and so on, including Pacific Salmon Foundation and its trust. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Some really great resources and such great support available to homeowners wanting to do this kind of work on their properties. I learned so much. I've been scribbling notes here and including understanding the type of shore. So knowing that impacts the type of protection strategy. Um, so important. Thank you for sharing that. And we've had lots of questions coming in. I do want to remind folks that we are tracking all of your questions. We will get to them following our third presentation. We will have a bit of a panel discussion. So please continue to type your questions into the chat, or if you want to wait until we get to the Q&A session, you just pop your hand up if you'd like to ask your question live. And I will now pass it over to our colleagues over at the Malahat Nation. Over to you, Megan and Stephen.
Okay. Hadi, Megan Sahatni, Clately Tse Hasya. Hello, my name is Megan. I'm a member of Clately Tene Nation in central northern BC. However, I grew up here in Huasanich territory and have been working with Malahat for 4 years as a part of their lands and environment team as a program lead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry, and my traditional name is Stalkemia. That comes from my my dad's side from his mom's side, and I'm a marine guardian, and I'm mostly focusing on the Gulf Stream River and protecting our killer whales, and yeah, mostly focused on the phytoplankton.
Yeah, so today we're gonna talk to you all about clam gardens, and we've kind of entitled our presentation Honoring Culture and Protecting Shoreline. So we'll try and link our clam garden work with shoreline protection, as that's the theme of this talk. So typically when we do clam garden work, we try to start our stewardship of the marine territory and lands in a good way. And we do this usually by inviting a knowledge keeper or an elder to come say a few words or have a prayer to start ourselves in a good way. So this evening, I just wanted to, oops, go back, sorry, ground ourselves in a good way. And I wanted to share a bit of an origin story of how this Salish Sea Islands in Husainich territory came to be. And in order to do that, I'm going to call on a paper by Robert Clifford, and he is a indigenous scholar who wrote about Husainich ancestral laws. So he states, during the time of Creator, Y'alls created the islands by throwing a number of Husainich ancestors out into the ocean and transformed them into the islands that are there today. We have a few small Husainich reserves on the Gulf Islands today, though much of those islands are now in private ownership, and some are on the United States side of the international border. So I just wanted to open up to kind of ground ourselves in an Indigenous lens, just knowing that First Nations people and Husainich people have such a deep connection with their lands and waters that they literally consider the islands as ancestors and relatives. They do this through the naming and through stories and building the connection to those places. For example, James Island is called I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Litos in Senchothan, which literally kind of translates to splash of water into the face. And if anybody's been to James Island, they know that Harrow Strait's very windy. There's a lot of erosion that happens, and um, through that we build the connection to the place. We know that that entity has those features, and I think that's just a really important place to start when we talk about shoreline protection is just grounding ourselves in those teachings. So Husainic people are in deep relationship with the lands and waters, like I was just saying. So many of the place names are intertwined with the stories and laws. And there's a long history of connection with the people. So just reiterating that it's so vital for these Husainic people and First Nations to continue to visit and spending time on the shorelines so that they can stay connected with their ancestors, which are literally transformed into the islands. Another thing I'd like to share is one of the ways that Indigenous people, and specifically Husainic culture, and I think Anishinaabe as well, have a 13 moon calendar. Um, this calendar is basically 13 moons that are kind of a way to keep time throughout the year. So, First Nations have had an ongoing relationship with their territories. They've learned about the weather, tides, shoreline changes, and those things have been learned over millennia. The indigenous stewardship practices that are well known in the area are fishing practices and mariculture, and they represent a deep understanding of the marine dynamics and things happening in the marine environment. Some of the kind of ancient technologies that have been used in Husainic territory include reef net fishing, fish traps, um, estuary and root gardens, and then today we're going to talk more about clam gardens. And all of these activities that happen Indigenous people kind of center around this 13 moon calendar. So certain species, such as salmon, will return to streams and rivers in certain times of the year. There's certain activities that happen in the winter in the big house. And then, there's a certain time of year when frogs start to reawaken, and that signals when certain other things are harvested. So through the 13 moon calendar, we can also ground our foundational knowledge and even relating to shoreline protection to these certain times of the year. And that's kind of what we try to do at Malahat Nation when we do our stewardship work is um, kind of root ourselves in the indigenous teachings of the ancestors that have come before us. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about clam gardens.
What is a clam garden? A clam garden is typically consist of rocks wall at the low tide line. Sediment is trapped by the wall and accumulates sediment and reduces the slope of the beach to form a flat terrace. Clam garden's sorry, the idle tide height for a target harvest. Clam garden species such as Pacific littlenecks, butter clams, horse clams, and cockles. Clam gardens vary in size, rock wall features, and beach types. As you can see in these screens, the bottom left is Fulford Harbor, the bottom right corner is Central Coast, and the top right is Quadra Island. Clam gardens function like engineered seawalls built by indigenous people to enhance food harvest. The rock wall breaks waves and may slow erosion in some places. The sediment builds up behind the clam garden wall and creates a natural buffer that protects upland areas. Often kelp and eelgrass grow near clam gardens, stabilizing sediment and reducing erosion. Clam gardens are a natural-based solution that blends technology and engineering, environment, and culture. And as you can see in the photo on this left, you can see this is a Pakwachin event and we're slowly building a clam garden wall. It's with the 5 different nations locally and some Hawaiian people are here to help us. Biodiversity and ecosystem services. Clam gardens are a biodiversity hotspot that helps protect the shoreline by supporting a stable and complex ecosystem. Increases productivity and growth rates of clams. Provides habitat for crabs, fish, sea stars, sea cucumbers, and oysters, and many other marine species. Improve water quality throughout the natural filtration processes. Clam gardens enhance ecosystem resilience compared to unmodified beaches. And on the photo on the right, you can see Andre Goldsmith is our coworker. He's working on the biodiversity and he's looking for like any type of baby like clams in the area. And you see in the middle right is Jalen Page is another coworker and she's at Russell Island, and she's holding a starfish right now. And the two photos on the left is Penelope came to one of our clam garden events and taught us how to make octopus traps. So they came and showed us and kind of where the ideal locations are to build the octopus traps in the clam garden. Clam garden adaptation strategy. Reviving clam gardens is a form of adaptation led by indigenous nations. Study has been done to show that clam gardens survive better in heat waves. In a clam garden, walled beaches versus unwalled beaches. Clam gardens provide a long-term coastal protection as the sea level rises or fall. As you see in the photo, it's me and my coworker Alex Daniels. We are taking all the big boulder rocks in the clam garden area and putting it to the clam garden wall to stabilize it and increase the longer enhance of the clam garden lifetime.
Okay, governance and management. So historically, clam gardens were managed by particular families and protocols, and this was kind of the ancestral way to take care of the beach. And clam gardens were also often also tended to by elders and women who stayed close to villages while men would go out on fishing and hunting trips. What we've found today, working with Malahat, is that clam gardens are a really great meeting places where relationships are formed and knowledge is shared. So, over the course of the past few years that we've been doing clam garden restoration work, we built relationships with other neighboring nations who've come to the beach to help us do beach tending activities. We've collaborated with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. On the picture on the left there, that's Sarah Dudas. She's a clam scientist and has helped us with our methodology for looking at the biodiversity of clams and measuring of clams to see how different size classes are changing from year to year. We've also collaborated with Parks Canada, and they have a Sea Gardens team that we go out to the Gulf Islands and visit all the different beaches that have clam gardens, some of which have been existing for up to 3,500 years. And this has been a really great opportunity for our guardians to have that cross-generational knowledge transfer, working with other folks, other elders that have been clam digging for their whole lives. And it's been really amazing to just see how that Sea Gardens program within the parks has grown. It also has given us an opportunity to engage with some other agencies, such as ECCC, CFIA, which is the Food Inspection Agency, and DFO through the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program, CSSP. And that program is responsible for testing clams for contamination, as well as testing clams on a regular basis for biotoxins that occur commonly in the summertime. So, super important to build those relationships up in this work. And then, of course, we try to also involve lots of non-government organizations. Kyla from Pacific Salmon Foundation came this year to one of our events, and we've invited, Sea Change. We've had folks from various, who else have we had come by? I mean, I'm blanking right now.
Lyaxton,
Yeah, different nations, Lyaxin, Cowichan,
Sartlip,
Sartlip.
Sao.
Yeah. Well, and NGOs were, who else did we have from like other groups? I'm trying to think. I'll come back to that one later, but we've had so many people come out and the relationship building is amazing that happens. And I just wanted to point out too that some of the jurisdictional challenges that happen in clam gardens can be barriers to the restoration work. So, as we were talking about earlier, the intertidal zone and the foreshore is kind of the transition zone in terms of ecology, but also the transition zone in terms of like jurisdiction. So dealing with like the oceanic environment is federally managed. The foreshore could be municipal or provincial based on if it's a marina or something else. So it is a very challenging place to manage. And I think that clam gardens offer a really interesting opportunity for us to discuss government and management, and I think a really good opportunity to build those relationships in a good way. And then I just had a note there that I think one of the challenges, and I think a good challenge also, is that we're trying to acknowledge both modern and ancestral laws in the management and kind of restoration of clam gardens. And when those two things come together, I think a lot of good work can be done.
Teachings and principles. Clam gardens represent a balance of relationship between people and the intertidal ecosystem. Everything is connected. Clam gardens are designed to sustain both human and non-humans kin. When the tide is out and the table is set, climb gardens embody principles of rest, rest, reciprocity and sustainability. The more we take care of the clams, the more they take care of us. Working as one team with a strong heart and mind to look after the ocean, not so much squeal 'em. Clam gardens show how human interventions can strengthen rather than harm nature's system. We take care of the lands and waters for the next 7 generations. And as you can see in this video we're about to show you, it's we formed a line to help. Well, we're just putting rocks into the clam garden wall to increase the strength of it, and we're just working together as one and have a strong mind and a strong heart.
But the stewardship department gave Steve all of our referrals, all of our. Yeah.
Future work. Clam gardens demonstrate how ancient engineering can inform modern design and protection of shorelines. Restoration projects can reconnect culture practices and modern environmental science, weaving Western science and indigenous knowledge. And as you can see in the photo on the left, we're all in a circle is we're doing like a last ceremony event in the summer. This was our last event that we hosted. We're all just like standing in a circle and talking about what's our highlight of the day and what we've learned. And in the photo on the right, you can see me and my dad. And then I'm handing out shell hash as like a farewell until next year kind of thing for the clam garden. And the shell hash is increases for I can't remember what shell hash does, but
Yeah, I can interject there. So yeah, shell hash is a really important we were talking a little bit before about physical processes and sediment sources and sinks. So shell hash is actually really important for clam growth and health of the ecosystem. So when you have a clam garden wall, and there's barnacles and other kinds of shell creatures living on the wall, they actually get scraped off and form a shell hash or tiny little fragments of shell that then get kind of mixed into the beach, and that forms a really good texture and a really good kind of interstitial material for clams to grow. Also, when indigenous people would consume clams, they would return the shells to the clam garden beach, and that would be another way that, the shell hash would be incorporated into the clam garden. And unfortunately, at Verdier Beach, where we are doing our restoration at Malahat, there's been a closure for many years. So there hasn't been people consuming clams for some time. And in fact, one of the teachings is that, the more you tend to a clam garden and the more you interact with that space, the better it is for the clams. It's almost like indigenous people and clams working together. And that kind of can be a little bit different than the Western concept of restoration where you leave things pristine and you don't touch stuff. So I think that that's one of those teachings is just the relationship building with the beach and with the clams and with all the other organisms that are living at the clam garden. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys so much. That's the end for us.
Thank you so much, Megan, Stephen Henry. I can't wait to get out and see the clam garden with you. Such a rich site of connection and learning and restoration. So thank you so much for sharing us with us this evening. Um, for those of you following the chat, you'll see there are lots of great questions coming in, and we do want to try to get to them all. And we've got quite a bit of time left this evening. So thank you all again for sharing your knowledge with us. And I'm just going to read through the questions, and some of them are specific to particular presentations, but by all means, any one of our panelists, please feel free to jump in and feel free to share your insights. This was a question that was actually submitted ahead of the webinar. We've got a real keener from Main Island asking about green waste that's discarded. So things like branches, ivy, blackberry, grass clippings, yanked broom, and daphne. Is discarding this kind of green waste into the sea acceptable? And just to give some context, Kenny, who asked the question, had gone to the Capital Regional District's bylaw department, then was referred to DFO and referred them back to bylaw. So sort of one of those gray areas as far as whose jurisdiction it is, but hoping that they can get a little bit of insight into whether or not it's appropriate to be discarding green waste into the ocean.
I can jump in on that one.
Thanks, Kyla.
Yeah, sometimes those questions are difficult to answer just because of the complex jurisdictional coverage of the shoreline. There's a lot of different players. But I would say, regardless of whether there was a bylaw against it or a law against doing that, I would not recommend this practice of dumping yard waste on the shoreline. There's many reasons. In general, the yard waste that's going onto the shoreline, it doesn't belong there, right? Most of the times, it's not native plant material. They can be invasive species, which could spread those plants to other shorelines, other neighboring properties, which we don't want. If it's coming from a residential area, there could be products that you're using in your garden, like chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or different kind of applications like that, which we don't want to be introducing onto the shoreline. Another reason is that it could be smothering different plant materials that are trying to grow there, and different microorganisms that are living on the beach. Essentially, it doesn't belong. And I'll leave it there. And if Kelly or Megan or Stephen want to jump in on that too.
Thanks, Kyla. Susan from Gabriola Island asks, Kyla, this one's for you. Why aren't log salvagers collecting some/most of the lots? I think that's meant to say logs that wash ashore. It's obvious, even from the upper shore, how much damage too many of them cause to the intertidal zone.
Yeah, I think that some log salvagers are removing some of them. But I think the issue comes down to these are logs that have escaped from log processing areas and log booms. And most of the logs that I'm seeing in my mapping work have cut ends. They don't have root wads. They don't have branches. These are not trees that have just fallen onto the shoreline. And with that, they are basically just sticks that are mobile on the shoreline. They roll back and forth. They might have been treated with different things, and so they might not be as useful or desirable to these log salvagers. But it comes back to recognizing the source of where they come from, and I think that's where there needs to be more accountability on the logging industry and on where these logs are coming from, which is the booms. Yeah, we don't have enough people coming to collect them, and so we need to kind of look back to where they're coming from.
Thanks, Kyla. And as a follow-up question that sort of relates to that, Sarah was asking, what was the name of the BC government legislation passed in October about marine cleanup? I think they're probably referring to the Clean Coast Act, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was just something that I had come across. But yes, it is the Clean Coast Act. I'm not sure if it has been passed at this point, but it was brought to the House of Commons and proposed. And I believe it's in discussions now, but yeah, it would help to address two of the most common sources of marine pollution, which are those wrecked and abandoned vessels, and then kind of debris left over from industrial practices and styrofoam from marinas and things like that. And I will pop a link to the West Coast Environmental Law article that I read about that, if folks are curious.
Thank you so much. And for anyone feeling like they're not able to keep up with all the great resources shared tonight, we will be composing an email with all of the links in there for you. So anyone who registered for this evening's webinar will get an email with a link to the recording from tonight, as well as all of the great links that are shared. So don't worry about frantically trying to scribble them down. We've got another question for you here, Kyla. About the mapping program that you presented, the hardshore armoring mapping. Did it map the Gulf Islands?
No, I'm afraid it didn't. We had a limited amount of time and a limited amount of resources. We did do the entire mainland coast of the east coast of Vancouver Island, so Victoria up to Port McNeill, with some gaps in between there. But yeah, unfortunately, with this project, we were not able to do the Gulf Islands. But I believe it's been shared in the chat, and Kelly had some of those maps in her presentation that the Islands Trust did do shoreline mapping in 2011, I believe it was. And that shows very similarly where there is hard armoring and then the other types of shore types along the various islands. So it's been since 2011. So if Islands Trust is looking to do it again, we are happy to share our methodology, how we collected the imagery, and yeah, really, really hoping to share this information and yeah.
Maybe we'll see if we can get Wilbur out on the shore again. Thank you so much. Mina Lee asks, and this is for anyone who wants to jump in, could you talk about road runoff as well as toxic chemicals from tires killing salmon?
I can take that one as well. Or Kelly, did you want to jump in and talk about
Sure, and sorry about
6PPD?
that. I did a little mini power outage there and lost my whole internet. So that's where I
Nice
went.
to have you back.
Yeah, and it's nice to be back. So, yeah, and Kyla can definitely supplement it for sure. But the whole 6-PPD quinone issue, tire particulates killing, juvenile coho in particular, is a really big deal. So I think in best practices, we can always think about trying to intercept water coming off of roadways, parking lots, impervious surfaces, upper areas of our lots, and intercepting it so it doesn't hit the aquatic environment, basically. And we can intercept it with rain gardens. We can intercept it with riparian vegetation, even structural. We can change the profile of our land in a way that it kind of intercepts that flow. And I think it's increasingly important. And I always think that if it's killing fish, then it can't be very good for us either. So it's probably just good that we keep it out of the aquatic environment. And I know with Green Shores, through the stormwater management credit, that's something that we really recognize efforts to do that. So, Kylie, do you want to add anything else as well?
Sure. Yeah, there is a ton of research going into 6-PPD quinone. That's the actual chemical that is in the tire wear toxin that interacts with ozone and creates this very toxic chemical that is lethal to coho and other fish. And just recently, there has been a company come out. It's called Flexus. I'm just going to put a link to their press release. They've been developing an alternative to 6-PPD, which is that the chemical that prevents tire wear in tires. And yeah, they found an alternative that they are testing currently. And so it's a long way away from solving the problem, but it's a really positive story. And there's lots of people working on this.
That's awesome, Colin. I just wanted to mention that I think DFO and other partners are monitoring at road crossings and such for this compound. So, but that's a really good point. There's a lot of tires rolling around out there, and it would be a lot to transition. But having those potential alternatives is really exciting.
I can also add a couple things about shellfish too. One of CSSP, when they do their testing, ECCC is the body that tests for um, fecal matter in the water column. And I think one of the challenges with some of the testing that happens around shellfish is that we don't really know where the contaminants are coming from. What is the origin of that fecal matter? Is it coming from people's septic tanks that are maybe old and leaking into, the groundwater and going into the ocean that way? Or is it runoff from um, roads? Is it coming from marinas? I think there's a lot of work to be done understanding the pathways of contamination and even, I think one of the major concerns of um, First Nations, specifically Malahat, is these derelict vessels that, there's these tiny little oil spills that are happening all the time, just diesel fuel, any kind of marine fuel that's going into the system and getting into the beaches is, building up, and it doesn't disintegrate over time once it gets into that beach sediment. So I think that that's a big concern too, is just all these little, um, I guess, influxes of material going into the sediment. So something to kind of, I don't know, I guess that's something we're trying to kind of leverage and figure out more and try and protect the shoreline more in that regard.
Thank you so much. Lots of work to be done. Colby asked whether the island maps are available to the public. So yes, if you're referring to the mapping that the Islands Trust did, you can search in the document library on the Islands Trust website. If you search Shoreline map, you should be able to find them for each local trust area. And again, we will send those links out via email, and we'll see if we can also link to them on our stewardship education page so that they're easier to find. Terry asks, looking ahead, how do you see Green Shore's strategy working with rising sea level and increasing wave power? Kelly, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Thanks very much, Chloe. Um, I think what's exciting about Green Shores is that it considers hybrid designs. It was one of the ones on that kind of spectrum of alternatives, and it really incorporates some harder elements. So you might have a revitalization, for example, which creates a bit of a structural profile to the shoreline. And then you're going to be using things like large woody debris, maybe some strategically placed headlands. So these alternatives, I think, are going to be important for a lot of the east coast of Vancouver Island, for that matter, where we've got what we call longer fetch, so that distance over which wind and waves is traveling and can pick up momentum and energy with, for example, within a storm, and interact with the beach in a more damaging way. So a good Green Shores design, that maybe one of these hybrid designs can be, I think, a really important alternative given things like sea level rise, increasing storm intensity, and just all the kinds of challenges that we see already going forward. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Susanna asks, can you talk more about the structural differences between the clam gardens versus things like seawalls and riprap? Like, how does the structure of the clam garden prevent scouring, for example? Megan, Stephen, I wonder if you want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I think I can tackle that one. I think, what I've learned about sea gardens and well, clam gardens over the years is that they're a really, really ancient technology. And I think the purpose of building a wall at the lower intertidal is that you're not necessarily getting that high level of energy. And you're actually, the whole purpose of a clam garden is to reduce the slope of the beach. So you're kind of like building a terrace. And that wall is meant to collect sediment. So in the Central Coast, you see, little pocket beaches that are formed because they might build a clam garden in between two rocky points or two kind of outcrops, and that was meant to facilitate like a um, almost quiescing that ocean environment so that it would be habitable by clams. So it's almost doing the opposite. It's not introducing scour, but it's actually collecting sediment and actually building a more of that gentle slope that you would want for like a clam habitat where it's a little bit less energy.
Thank
I
you
just
so
add to that,
much.
make a point. I think it's about where it's located, how it's designed, and even with rocky headlands in green shores projects. So this is different from a clam garden, but it's about the placement of them. You want water to be able to flow through them, and that's I would assume that's something similar to a clam garden. You want the water to flow because that's where the nutrients enter the system, right? And as compared to a seawall or riprap that's been kind of jammed together, where you don't have that interstitial spatial movement of water, that's where the problems occur. So excellent point about lower slope as well. I just thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Erin is asking, I'm wondering what, if anything, might be supported ecologically where empty clamshells form middens as they're deposited back to the sea.
Okay, sorry, repeat that one more
Yeah,
time.
that one's a little
Yeah.
tricky. What might be supported ecologically where empty clamshells form middens as they're deposited back to the sea?
That's an interesting question. If like the clamshells themselves form a habitat. I know that one of the things that we were talking about, shell hash being important. And I think, depositing shells on a clam garden beach to kind of return those shell matter into the beach habitat. And then over time, it breaks down and forms part of that sediment. I mean, I was talking with one of our colleagues at Paquachin Nation, and he lifted like a handful of sediment, and it was really shell hashy. Like I would say almost over 50-60% shell hash. And he's like, that's what you need for butter clam habitat, which is one of the species that are really desired by harvest by elders, First Nations people. They're the really big clams. And I think that that midden material, when you see that kind of broken up shell, is really important. And I don't know if like the shells themselves would form habitat, but as they break down, for sure, they're very important. And I think there's even possibly some thought around the calcium carbonate in the shells being sort of like a local protection against like ocean acidification. I'm not sure how much research has been done, but I've heard that been talked about in the clam garden circles a bit. So that could be another like chemical um interesting piece of it. But yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you, Megan. Um, Also on the topic of clam gardens, and Stephen, you might have an answer for this one. Is there a central place where folks who want to volunteer to help build clam gardens or do that restoration work can participate in projects that are going on?
Any ideas?
No idea.
It's an interesting question. I often get asked this question. I think there are so many nations doing amazing work in their communities, and there's been modern clam gardens. I know Paquachin has built like a new clam garden at Coles Bay. Down in the San Juan Islands, Swinomish Nation has this huge clam garden that they've built. I think there's a lot of opportunity to get involved. And I think it's just about, coming to these circles. I'm happy to, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to leave my email. Perhaps Chloe, you can share it. And um, I'm happy to invite whoever is interested to come out at our following clam garden events in the summer. We usually do 3 or 4 in the summer. Of course, the low tides in the winter are in the middle of the night, so we kind of have focused on summer restoration work. But yeah, I am happy to invite anybody here that's interested. And I think it's just about reaching out to First Nations and building those relationships and uplifting the communities that are doing the work and just being there to support. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much. This one might be for you, Kelly. Anne asks, would Green Shores host a session on a beach to pull neighbors together? If a waterfront owner uses the expedited process and does not hire a certified Green Shores consultant, so the main principles and fish are not protected, then what rights do the public, including government, to properly assess a Green Shores process that encompasses the ecology of the beach, not just private property profits?
Okay, I'm just trying to get the question part of that.
Yeah. So
Is
maybe
it,
just the first part of it is, would
yeah.
Green Shores host a session on a beach to pull neighbors together? So, working a little more collectively rather than sort of portioned off elements of the foreshore.
Yeah, no, we definitely have done that. No, thanks for the question. We've definitely done that. I would say that we have a Green Shores local government working group. So we've got different municipalities that participate and kind of share ideas and learn from each other and advance nature-based solutions in general. So we've had like outreach sessions on the shore. I would say through Resilient Coast for Salmon, we've had outreach events as well that have reached the general public to talk about nature-based solutions, green shore, salmon, those types of things. And what was it kind of the third part of that, Chloe? There was another.
I think that this person, and they're saying they're on Salt Spring, is seeing that some conflicts arising perhaps in terms of foreshore use, and so trying to be proactive about how do we get people together and actually sort of do what's following best practice for the entire beach, as opposed to just sort of that narrow lens of the private property sort of profits. So how do we get people working together so it's not just sort of landholder by landholder?
Oh no, excellent point. I would say that, I mean, Green Shores overall is meant to be more the carrot than the stick. So it's not regulatory, it's not mandatory, it's intended to be an incentive. And I would say that the approach we've always taken is to educate people, help them to understand, and then act, kind of the fundamental mandate of SCBC. And so I think when you understand something and, you know the reason why it needs to be protected, then you want to act appropriately. And I think there's even a quote to that effect. And bringing people together, again, we always promote what we call a neighborhood scale approach. So having more than one homeowner working with the adjacent or nearby homeowners to do something that helps more of the shoreline. Because again, when we think of that larger littoral cell or that stretch along which sediment and water is moving, the ocean and the waves and the sediment doesn't care that you have your little lot. It does matter to the bigger scale of the ocean. And so neighborhood scale is trying to address that. That having been said, it's been really challenging. It's been really challenging to get people that have the same need at the same time and the same amount of resources to do something collectively. But something we're always aiming for and trying to promote the benefits because there's economy of scale. For example, when you have your contracting team, they come out one time for 3 properties versus one, that type of thing. So I think that brings people together. And so yeah, increased awareness, I would say. And yeah, we're trying to do some of that baseline study as well. Sometimes we've had a project done because some of the baseline study in the Bowser area and around Qualicum Beach. Northwest Hydraulics consultants who are a coastal engineering firm did some baseline studies for us. So sometimes that's another approach where we're trying to provide something that's an important tool, along with the island stress mapping, for example. Having those tools in place, I think, can bring people together too. And I am aware that there have been some projects proposed on Salt Spring. I mean, I'm sure there's more than one, but one of which we were told was a Green Shores project, but we never heard of it, and SCDC was never contacted. So that's something else I think is helpful is if someone's even interested remotely in applying or trying to apply Green Shores, is that they contact SCDC early on, and we'll see if we can help. So
Thanks
that
so
wasn't too long
much.
with.
No, and I know you featured some of this in your presentation, Kelly, but as a follow-up, Colby is asking, what are the best resources for helping with designing a green shore approach for a homeowner? So what are your sort of like top tips?
Yeah, so I always send people to the website. There's some great research resources there. I also, there's what we call Green Shores Approved Professionals. That was a level 3 training that I mentioned. There's a small group of us that are, so we're basically combining our area of expertise or profession with a solid understanding of green shores. And those types of people can be helpful on a project team. But there's also a lot of, I would say, consultants working on shorelines that are very, have a lot of expertise. And some of them have been to level 1 or level 2 training or both, and those are great people to reach out to as well. And I can always, try to help if people are interested. So
Um, a follow-up to the conversation around disposing of green waste. So Carly's wondering, you know, are you seeing homes using branches to help berm and protect erosion? Like, is there sort of some intention behind how this garden waste is being used? And she's sharing that she's seeing a lot of that where she lives and struggling with how to address it. Kyla, I wonder if you want to take that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I haven't seen that myself. I'm trying to picture what that would look like. In terms of logs being used in shoreline restoration, there's definitely some different thought schools on that, whether logs are useful in shoreline restoration, whether to um, attach them or tether them to the beach in some way, or just leave them loose on the shoreline. So yeah, I'm wondering about the yard waste in that kind of application. So I would think that if it's a large enough branch or a whole tree that still has roots or branches and complexity to it, you could certainly kind of like wiggle it into the sediment so that it's not moving around. That's the main issue with these cut and process logs on the shoreline, is that they don't have that complexity to them. So they're rolling around, they're mobile, they're really scouring the environment and burying or smothering vegetation in the habitat there. Um, yeah, I'm not too sure about that. I would definitely question this species being used, because if it's not a tree species that is native to this area, that might also introduce different issues, different like blights, pests, fungi to the area that you might not want on the shoreline. But if it's, say, a Douglas fir or a cedar, arbutus, big leaf maple, some of these tree species that are certainly native to this area, I could see that being appropriate.
Thanks. Did anyone else have anything to add?
I'll just mention, and that's a great point about anchoring. The jury is still out on anchoring, but in general, I think kind of the historic practice of trying to anchor one end with chains and stuff is kind of outdated. But what can be done is one end can be submerged by excavating the end of the log. And Holly had a good point that if you've got a root wad or something more naturalized and adding that complexity and just ability for the piece of wood to anchor to the shoreline naturally, that's what you're aiming for. Interesting, like I was just in Nova Scotia, and they don't have the accumulations of woody debris that we have out here. It's really seems to be a kind of, I'm not sure how far up, up and down the coast it is, but it's definitely a BC issue, and it's very significant because, like you said, those accumulations of logs with cut off ends are just battering rams, and so they don't provide the habitat because they move too much and they cause additional erosion, and they're just more of a nuisance than a help. So, but large woody debris used well can be very important for stabilizing. And I would say should be actually kind of almost engineered in the design, like its placement, its orientation to waves, should all be, consideration. And that I was mentioning the Dyke Road Park project, the demonstration site, they actually decided not to put very much large woody debris there because they feel that the energy doesn't warrant having it in, and it has potential issues. So, making the choice that way. So just, considering all the factors that go into placement and type and all those things, and anchoring, but anchoring naturally.
Thank you. On that note, Diane's wondering, is there a way to anchor logs that works well?
Yeah, I would say excavating one end, and or using a piece of wood or woody debris that has a naturalized root wad on it. Going for those two things, I think will put you in good shape in the sense that the wood will stay hopefully more in place. And people, I always find homeowners are just so wise. They notice their shorelines change over the seasons, and that's another way, I guess, to look at it too. Is sometimes the larger pieces stay more in place, but surprising sometimes the very large pieces can be very mobile as well with different storms. So
I think folks will be paying particular attention after watching this, knowing that we're heading into storm season here on the coast. Sue Ellen is wondering, any tips for moving heavy, slippery rocks over a slippery beach? I saw a net being carried. Was that a rock inside? If a landholder wanted to start sea gardening. So any tips for moving heavy, slippery rocks over a slippery beach?
Yeah, we're using a net in the photo, and there's like other certain carts that you can buy online as well. But yeah, we mostly mainly use it's like a two-man job, so we gather up two people, then like have a net and do our best to get the rock in the net.
Yeah.
So safety in numbers and using a net.
Yeah, I think that's something that, we always tell people when they come down to help out with clam garden work, just a good pair of rubber boots and just watch your footing and stuff. And I think that's something too that in considering the intergenerational knowledge transfer piece, like sometimes it's so hard to get those knowledge keepers and elders down to those beach habitats because, you know, mobility and access problems to beaches. Sometimes you have to walk down a beach access and then walk like half a kilometer down to a clam garden beach. So again, just like reiterating, like some of these places are hard to get to and access is hard, but um yeah, and then just like if a landowner wanted to start sea gardening, I mean, it's always an interesting question because, clam garden work is very centered in community and very much like an activity that is meant for enhancing food security. So I think one of the things that I would suggest is just get to know your beach, observe how the water is hitting the beach, what animals are using the beach, and just um, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there about clam gardens. I would suggest the Clam Garden Network. They teach you how to identify a clam garden. There's a lot of legacy clam gardens that exist all up and down the coast, so you might stumble upon one that hasn't been restored. And they also talk a lot about, you know, ways in which to support clam garden work. So I think that the Clam Garden Network is a really great resource and full of amazing people that have been doing this work for a long time.
Thanks, Megan. We'll add that to our list. Um, I don't see any other questions coming in through the chat. Um, I want to thank each of you so much for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. And I wonder if before we close, we could go around and hear from each of you. If you could share one thing that's inspiring you in your work around shoreline protection these days. Um, and Kyla, I see you smiling, so maybe I'll start with you.
Okay. I mean, this evening has been really inspiring. Learning more about the clam garden work. I did have a chance to go and help out one day and just really appreciate Stephen and Megan for sharing their knowledge here today and yeah, sharing this information with a broader audience because it's really wonderful to see this tending to a shoreline and this return of a cultural practice is really special. And if anyone has a chance to be a part of it, I certainly recommend it if you're invited. So yeah, I'm inspired by my colleagues here.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Kelly.
yeah, I Boy, I echo that, Kyla. It for me, it's always about the people and the learning. And I really enjoyed learning about clam gardens tonight too. And I guess I see it as part of, for me, what's very interesting, and I think very hopeful for all of us, are looking to nature-based solutions. So how nature works on shorelines can give us a lot of information if we take the time to observe and learn from what's done naturally. And I think we've got a lot of change ahead of us with climate change. So building in that resiliency early on, being aware of those potential changes, and doing designs and implementing projects, thoughtfully and in a way that, again, I guess meets, what people want, because we love our shorelines and what the environment needs. And if we've got a healthy environment, we'll have healthy people. So, well, I would share.
Thanks, Kelly. And that's a great sort of foreshadowing to our next webinar coming up in February is going to be on nature-based solutions for climate mitigation, including how to build a rain garden. So I'm hoping folks will register for that one as well and keep building on your knowledge. Megan, Stephen, can we hear from you?
For me, I think it's just seeing like everyone come together, working as one and sharing each other's knowledges about the clam garden stuff. And just as an indigenous person, just seeing the culture being brought to life again and just seeing everyone work together, kind of coming in as a family. Just kind of, for me, it's kind of heartwarming in a way.
Oh, Stephen always makes me want to cry sometimes. I do. Yeah, I really appreciate, I appreciate Stephen actually. He has grown so much in this work, and I'm just so excited that he is just as excited as me about it, and the community too, getting everybody inspired. I think being trained in kind of Western science and going to university and stuff, I was so used to having an omniscient view when doing like restoration, and it was always me and nature or the ecosystem as separate things. And I think one of the greatest teachings in doing clam garden work and working with indigenous nations is that you start to see yourself as a part of the ecosystem, and you start to see yourself as a player, like not a player, but you're in relationship with all of these different beings. You're in relationship with the clams and the fish and all of these amazing animals, and we can support each other, and we can be aware and observe and really steward our environment when we start to see ourselves as part of that relationship and kind of working with that reciprocity. So I think I'm really excited. I think we're all working towards that together, and yeah, it's just really nice to share with you all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for, yeah, those wise words around that relational approach and how we are just one part of the whole ecosystem, and we need to be a little more conscientious about how we work with the ecosystem. Um, there's one quick question that I'm going to sneak in here because Diana really wants to know if I think I see a clam garden, where do I report it to? Should I tell someone?
Yeah, so Clam Garden Network, I will get you that connection there, that contact. Also, John Harper, who is a geomorphologist, has been finding and researching clam gardens on the coast for decades. And I can also give you his contact information if you're interested, because chances are he knows where it is. Maybe he doesn't, but he knows how to identify them. And if you were to send him pictures, I'm sure he would be very interested and be excited to talk about it. So, yeah.
And thanks, Kyla, for just popping the website to the Clam Garden Network in the chat there. We'll make sure that's in our resource list that we send out. So once again, tonight's session has been recorded. We'll be sharing that link on our Islands Trust YouTube page, as well as on our Stewardship Education Program page. We'll send it to you in an email so it's easy to use. And Stephen, Megan, Kelly, Kyla, I just want to once again thank you so much for your generosity, for your passion, for being with us tonight to learn more about your experience. I am seeing a lot of beautiful comments in the chat, a few people feeling inspired and just really, really grateful for the time they've spent with you tonight. So thank you so much. I want to finally just encourage folks who are with us tonight to register for the next two upcoming webinars in this year's Stewardship Education Program. So on February 4th, as I mentioned, we are having a session on climate adaptation, so rain gardens and other nature-based solutions that you can use. And on March 4th, we will be talking about working towards a fallow deer strategy for the Southern Gulf Islands. You can register for those through our website, Stewardship Education Program. Find us on social media, and I will include those links in our email. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a beautiful evening, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next session in the Stewardship Education Program. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chloe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.